said, Jesus borrows a lot during this week. And I don't think I'd ever thought of it in terms of Jesus borrowing things until I'm reading these stories with the thought of generosity kind of processing through my head. I mean, truth be told, Jesus owns very little in his entire life that he spends on the earth. You could almost build an entire Bible study that gets you all the way through the Gospels by asking the question, how many things did Jesus have to borrow during his life? But particularly during this final week, there's a lot of borrowing happening. Obviously, we're already mentioning the donkey. And like I said, all four Gospels point out the donkey. I read Mark because Mark commented that Jesus returned it, and I thought that was an important concept that went with borrowing. Jesus meant to give it back. But Matthew and John actually took time to reflect on the prophetic nature of the passage. I just wanted to show you what Matthew said. Matthew said, go into the village over there. As soon as you enter it, you're going to see the donkey tied with its colt beside it. And so Matthew points out that there's two donkeys, the mama and the baby. Untie them and bring them both to me. If anyone asks what you're doing, just say, the Lord needs them, and he will immediately let you take them. This took place to fulfill the prophecy that said, tell the people of Jerusalem, look, your king is coming to you. He is humble, riding on a donkey, riding on a donkey's colt. Now, the prophecy that Matthew and John make sure the reader understand actually comes from the minor prophet Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 9. And that reads basically the same. Rejoice, O people of Zion. Shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble, riding on a donkey's colt. Now, if we've been to more than one or two Palm Sundays, we probably are familiar with this passage and the idea of it, and yet it's really lost, I think, on our modern sensibilities. What it would mean for a victorious king to ride on a donkey into a town. You know, if someone did that for us, we would just kind of shrug our shoulders and be like, I guess they're in a Jesus play. I don't know. So the significance of what Jesus is doing in this day has to do very much with the symbolism of that donkey and who he's proclaiming himself to be in this moment. A lot of times we just relegate the idea of donkey to mean that Jesus is just saying, I'm just a humble guy. And it's true, the donkey indicates humility. That's what Zechariah says, but it's a little bit more than that. You see, if Jesus had ridden in on a big horse, a stallion, a steed, it would have indicated that he's riding in on a war horse. And he's saying to Jerusalem, I'm coming to take over. I come in battle. I am coming to overthrow this kingdom. But when a king rides in on a donkey, and Jesus isn't the first to do it, this was a common symbol in the ancient world. When a king rides in on a donkey, what he's saying is, there is already peace here. I have already overcome here. I am already established as king. You see, Jesus rides in on the donkey, and it is humble, but it's because he's already King of Kings. He doesn't have to prove to Jerusalem who he is. Whether Jerusalem recognizes him or not, he is King of Kings. And it's interesting because what we're told in the beginning of the Gospels, this Jesus who's coming, this king who's coming that threatens Herod and the kingdom that's established, the angels say, he comes in peace. Well, Jesus comes in on the donkey to say, not only do I come in peace, I come as peace. So that's the full meaning of this donkey. But my point is he didn't even have the donkey to ride in on. He had to borrow it from somebody, which he sent his disciples to go and do. But it's not the only thing he borrows that week. He also borrows a room. And all four Gospels tell us about the room. And it's almost the same story. I'm going to read a portion of that from the book of Mark. Mark writes, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, so we're a little bit more than halfway through the week now, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, Jesus' disciples asked him, where do you want us to go to prepare the Passover meal for you? have no idea where they're even going to have their Passover meal. I mean, some of us are kind of having this conversation, right, around this time. Who's having Easter dinner? Or maybe it's already established in your family who always has the Easter dinner. Well, the disciples, they don't know. They don't know where their Passover meal is going to be, so they ask. So Jesus sent two of them into Jerusalem with these instructions. As you go into the city, a man carrying a pitcher of water is going to meet you. Follow him. At the house he enters, say to the owner, the teacher asks, where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples? He will take you upstairs to a large room that's already set up. That's where you should prepare our meal. So the two disciples went into the city and found everything Jesus had said, and they prepared the Passover meal there. So in Mark, we read that it's already set up for them. The disciples have just asked the question, where are we going? They don't have any idea. And Jesus says, you're going to go to town, and you're going to be led to the room that's already ready for us. So that's the Passover meal. And then we get through the passion, the arrest, the crucifixion, and all four Gospels also tell us that Jesus is buried in a borrowed tomb. It was a new tomb, and it belonged to a secret follower, Joseph of Arimathea. As evening approached, Joseph, a rich man from Arimathea who had become a follower of Jesus, went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate issued an order to release it to him. Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a long sheet of clean linen cloth. He placed it in his own new tomb, which had been carved out of the rock, and then he rolled a great stone across the entrance and left. So in this one, we discover who the borrowed item belongs to. But did you notice in the other two stories, the donkey and the room, we don't even know who the owner of the donkey or the room are. They're just people who somewhere along the way had met Jesus and had said, hey, if you ever need a donkey, if you ever need to borrow my room, what's mine is yours. We concluded last month when we talked about generosity that disciples are generous people. We talked about having a posture of dependence on God for what we need rather than ourselves. That if we're leaning on God or the world for what we need, our posture is going to be bent in that direction, and that's an unsustainable posture for our life. But that if we are leaning upon Christ and God for what we need, that is an aligned posture that allows us to walk with strength and stability in our life. And so we asked, where is my posture of dependence? Is it on myself or on God? We addressed fear and faith as the intentional things that we've got to work on in ourselves as we increase generosity. And so some questions that we might ask ourselves if we put ourselves in the shoes of the people who are following Jesus, especially those whom Jesus is borrowing from in these stories. What is something of mine that the Lord may need of me that might move the mission forward? Like, do I have something in my possession that the Lord might come and say, I have need of that, and I'll return it, but for now, can I borrow it? Can I give that something without expectation, but trust God to make a good return on it? Am I inclined to share or be selfish? Probably, if we're being really honest about our human nature, we've had some inclinations to be selfish in the past. But what really struck me as I tried to think like a disciple as I read these stories is how much faith went into all of these exchanges. The faith of the people who offered the items, but also the faith of the disciples to even go and ask for them. I mean, my first thought was how hard or easy it was to give these items. Like, I had to look up and see the value of what these things are that Jesus asked for from these people. I mean, yes, the donkey is livestock, but donkeys in the ancient world were a means of transportation. And not just for like one person to ride, but donkeys as beasts of burden could carry quite a few pieces of luggage to the next town. So I'm thinking, like, the donkey's like a Suburban, you know? Like the donkey's a pretty serious SUV that's going to get a family from point A to point B. And the fact that a family now has two donkeys, that's like an extended cab, right? Like, this guy's doing well that he's got two donkeys to carry his family from point A to point B. And Jesus sends his disciples and says, I'm going to take both of them. I'll bring it back. That's a tough call for the new SUV parked out in the driveway. Upper room. An upper room that seats more than a dozen people, that comes with servants, because that's who the disciples meet up with in the street, the guy carrying the water. Probably this is the type of room that was rented out for these occasions like Passover and was a significant means of income for the owner of this room. It's likely, just like in the large venue spaces that we have here on the coast, that for an occasion like Passover, that thing's rented out years in advance. You don't just show up the week of and be like, hey, can I have your room? Unless you're Jesus. And somehow that's been taken care of. And then a new tomb. It's actually quite uncommon for a person in the ancient world to have a new tomb. Owning property in the ancient world was its own special thing anyway. That a person would own property to live in and own property to die in indicates a different level of wealth. And the fact that it's new, well, here's what that means. Because we kind of think of graves and we think, well, they're all new, right? So in the ancient world, here in Jerusalem, they call it hewing, the hewn rock. They dig out this place, right? And the first place that you step into, there's like shelves to lay out the body that's been wrapped in spices and cloth, because there's not a true embalming process for this people group. And so they lay the body out, and they wait and wait and wait until that body has gone through the process of decay. And then later the family will go and put the bones of that body into a box called an ossuary. And then there's a back room to that cave where they would set the bones of their ancestors and leave that shelf for the next body that needs to be laid out. So that's why the tombs were used and reused by families. Joseph of Arimathea is wealthy enough at this stage in his life that he gets to purchase a new tomb for his family that will be for him and a legacy for the generations to come. And the fact that he looks at Jesus' disciples and at Pilate and says, I would like this tomb to be the place where Jesus is buried, not only indicates a serious amount of wealth in his life, but it says either one of two things, and I'm not sure which. It either says that Joseph looks at the rest of society and says, this man is as a brother to me. He is now a part of my family, that he can be buried in my family's tomb, which would have significance for his family moving forward, to align himself in that way. Or he's saying to the rest of Jesus' family, now this is your tomb. Either way, it's a huge sacrifice. And that's the point. These are pretty big sacrifices that these people are making. And so then it occurred to me that the disciples included in these stories of going and asking for these pretty big gifts, the awkward moment of requesting them. And I was so thankful that I got to see this awkward moment, because there's not a more awkward person on the planet than me when I have to go ask somebody for something. Like, I communicate for a living, and yet when I get ready to ask somebody for something, I can't find nouns and verbs. I forget what words are because I get so nervous about asking, and apparently these disciples had the same issue. Jesus said, I want you to say this. Because he probably guesses that once they get there, they're going to be a little dumbstruck. Hey, who told you could untie that donkey? And good neighbors, right? Calling them out on that. It was like the scavenger hunt of Holy Week. And how much faith did these disciples have to follow through with Jesus' instructions? Can I just confess here that Leanne's personality would be such that if Jesus had said to me, go down the road and untie the donkey of the stranger, probably you're going to get yelled at, so say this, I would be like, can't I just go buy a new donkey? That is to say, can I do this my way, Jesus, instead of yours? Because your way seems hard. I mean, Jesus basically tells these guys, go go commit grand theft auto or livestock. I don't know. Go. It's a hard thing that he asks them. And the words that he gives them to say is, my master needs them. And then when you get to the story of the tomb, it's like, how much of a plan is there? How much of a plan did Jesus have, knowing that he was going to die? And it occurred to me, God had a plan. It's just the disciples didn't know it. And I actually felt some relief when I got to that point of clarity. God had a plan. Jesus had been let in on the plan because Jesus stayed in perfect alignment with the Father, because he was filled with the Holy Spirit and he spent time in God's presence, and he never did anything without the Father first telling him to do it, which, by the way, is the point of this whole series, because we have the same access to the Father. Okay, so the story is Jesus knows the plan, God had a plan, but the disciples didn't know the plan. And I thought, well, that makes me a good disciple, because there are so many times that I think there's got to be a plan here, and I just can't see it. And so I began to wonder, like my imagination kind of ran away with me. I tried to imagine, did Jesus encounter this man and you know, he healed his wife maybe. And the man was like so grateful that he healed his wife that he's like, look, I notice you guys are always walking here and there and everywhere. If you ever need my donkey, I'm just going to leave it tied outside. Just, it's yours. Come and get it. Or maybe there was an encounter with a man and he was so grateful that Jesus had brought his lost son back to him that he said, if you ever need my banquet space, my family loves throwing parties, but if you ever need it for yourself, you just say the word, it's yours. You don't even have to give me any heads up. You come, you show up, you knock on the door, and it's yours. I don't know how long Joseph had been following in the shadows, but there was something about that day, that moment, that it occurred to him, if this man is who he says he is, then giving him this space that represents not only my life, but my death and the legacy of my family is the most holy thing that I can do. All of that is imagined. I don't know that Jesus had those conversations with those people. I just know that I've seen those kinds of interactions between you and me and God, where we have these moments with the living God and it changes our lives, and we think, if you ever need it, Jesus, just come and get it. And what if the disciples had refused to do what Jesus called them to do and never gave those people the opportunity to give because they had a better way? And it convicted me about the number of times that I'm afraid to ask, that I want to say your no for you because it's awkward, because it's hard, because I'd rather do it myself, because I know myself can get it done. And I don't participate in the way the kingdom is made to be a family, to say, hey, let's do this together. Because I wasn't paying attention when you had that moment with Jesus where you said, it's yours, just come and get it. A little story to just uh, 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 an example of this. A few months ago, some months back actually now, Fred called. Fred owns a business supply company, and he said, "Leanne, I've got two gigantic dry erase boards that have no home. It's a long story, but the people that they were supposed to take them, they don't want them, and I have them, and I don't have anything to do with them. Does the bridge need two gigantic dry erase boards?" And I was like, no, we don't have gigantic walls. We already have small dry erase boards in our classrooms, and but before I said no, there was a catch in me. I was like, I'm supposed to say yes to this. And I didn't know why, because we did not need two gigantic dry erase boards. And typically, as you probably know, I'm inclined to say no thank you when you offer things that we really don't need because we don't have a lot of storage space. And we would like to pile people in here, not stuff. And so I don't take on a lot of extra things, but there was something about this. Hey, Leanne, can you use this? I was like, no, I can't use it, but I really need to say, yeah, bring it on in. And true to his word, they were gigantic dry erase boards. And so we set them against a wall in there. You probably noticed those boxes for a while and probably thought, what in the world is that? And so then we started talking about moving to a new building. And I was like, well, that's what it's for right there. Look, God provided. We're going to have these gigantic dry erase boards to put on new walls. And then we didn't get new walls, right? Like that fell through. And I was like, well, I don't know. I guess they'll sit here till I know the next thing. And that's when I was in a prayer meeting with a woman named Sharon. And Sharon has recently started a halfway home for women who are escaping trafficking. They're literally taken up out of a trafficking situation and taken to a safe place where they can heal and perhaps sober up and learn and become well before they have to venture out into the world again. And one of the things that they do at Jubilee Havens is they teach. And so Sharon sent out a long list of things that Jubilee Havens needed, and it included, all kind of common things that a bedroom might need for these women to sleep, and bathrooms might need for these women to live, and a living room might need, and kitchens might need. But then there was a classroom, and on that list of things, there was a dry erase board. And I called Sharon when I saw the list, and I said, hey, do you still need that dry erase board? And she kind of laughed and she said, I know it was a strange thing to put on the list, but God said, put it all on the list, Sharon, I can provide. And I said, well, I tell you what, I've actually got two. So I only need one. I said, then you can have one. And she said, it's little or it's big? I said, it's huge. Don't come in your little bitty car to get this dry erase board. She sent me a thank you card last week about how they're using that dry erase board to teach women the truth of God's word, the promises over their lives. I don't know that that's what Fred intended when he said, hey, this customer doesn't need a dry erase board. But God had a plan. It was just some simple yeses, you know? An awkward phone call probably from Fred to me. Hey, do you need this? An awkward yes on my part, and then an inconvenience of having to lean them against a wall. An awkward moment on Sharon's part where she had to put such a request on a list. And God had a plan. God had a plan for a dry erase board. God had a plan for a donkey. God had a plan for a room that would become the central meeting place of the first church of the Holy Spirit there in Jerusalem. God even had a plan for a new tomb that had never been used. Which brought me to a concluding thought. There was a plan in place. Even though the disciples couldn't see the plan until they walked out the plan. And I'm guessing that everyone in these stories were so thankful that the disciples asked. I'm so glad you asked. I'm so glad I got to participate in this story. Because in all of these situations, what was once a valuable possession became an invaluable moment in the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And just to top it all off, everything that Jesus borrowed, he returned. Even the tomb. But that's next week's story. In the name of the Father, Son, and